When the Historical Society of Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, acquired the Hartwell family estate in 2018, archivist Margaret Thornton expected to find the typical collection of documents and photographs that wealthy families of the early 20th century usually left behind. What she discovered instead was a single photograph from 1915 that would unravel one of the most elaborate deceptions in American family history. The image showed what appeared to be a joyous family reunion, with 3 generations gathered on the sprawling lawn of the Hartwell mansion. Everyone was smiling, everyone was perfectly positioned, and everyone looked genuinely happy to be together. But there was one detail that seemed slightly off. An ornate wooden chair sat prominently in the center of the group, beautifully carved and obviously expensive, yet completely empty. When modern forensic analysis revealed what was actually sitting in that chair, investigators uncovered a story of love, loss, and a grandmother's final wish that had driven her family to commit what amounted to the perfect crime. The photograph had been carefully preserved in a leather-bound album that had been discovered in the library of the Hartwell mansion, tucked away behind a collection of first-edition novels that had apparently not been disturbed for decades. The album contained dozens of family photographs spanning nearly 50 years, from the 1870s through the 1920s, documenting the rise of the Hartwell family from modest beginnings to considerable wealth and social prominence. Margaret had been working through the collection systematically, cataloguing each photograph and researching the family members depicted in them. The Hartwells had been prominent in Lancaster County society, with interests in banking, real estate, and manufacturing that had made them one of the wealthiest families in the region. The 1915 reunion photograph had immediately caught Margaret's attention, not because of anything obviously unusual about it, but because of its exceptional quality and the obvious care that had been taken in its composition. The image showed 23 family members arranged in a carefully orchestrated group on the lawn of the family estate, with the imposing Victorian mansion serving as a backdrop. The photograph had been taken by a professional photographer, as evidenced by the sophisticated lighting and composition. Every family member was clearly visible and properly positioned, from the youngest children sitting cross-legged on the grass in front to the adults standing in carefully arranged rows behind them. The clothing and hairstyles were typical of the period, and everyone appeared to be dressed in their finest attire for what was obviously an important family occasion. What had struck Margaret as unusual was the prominent placement of an empty chair in the center of the group. The chair was clearly expensive and beautifully crafted, with intricate wooden carvings and an ornate design that suggested it held special significance for the family. It had been positioned as if it were meant for someone important, perhaps the family patriarch or matriarch, yet it remained conspicuously vacant. Margaret had initially assumed that the chair had been intended for someone who had been unable to attend the reunion, perhaps due to illness or travel difficulties. It was not uncommon for families of the period to include symbolic representations of absent loved ones in formal photographs, and the empty chair might have been meant to honor someone who could not be present. However, as Margaret had researched the family history and examined other photographs in the collection, she had begun to notice some inconsistencies that suggested the story might be more complex than it initially appeared. The 1915 photograph had been labeled in the album as a family reunion, summer 1915, Mao. But Margaret had found evidence that several of the family members shown in the image had not actually been in Pennsylvania during the summer of 1915. The most significant discrepancy involved the family matriarch, Eleanor Hartwell, who had been the wife of the family patriarch, Samuel Hartwell, and the mother of 6 children. According to the family records that Margaret had found, Eleanor had died in March 1915, several months before the supposed reunion had taken place. Yet when Margaret had examined the photograph more closely, she had noticed something that had made her question whether Eleanor's absence from the reunion had been as straightforward as the family records suggested. While the ornate chair in the center of the group was clearly empty, there appeared to be subtle indentations in the seat cushion that suggested someone had been sitting there when the photograph was taken. Margaret had called in Dr. James Patterson, a forensic photographer, who specialized in analyzing historical images for evidence of alteration or manipulation. Dr. Patterson had extensive experience in examining photographs from the early 20th century, and had developed techniques for detecting signs of digital or chemical manipulation that might not be immediately apparent to the naked eye. When Dr. Patterson had examined the 1915 reunion photograph using advanced digital enhancement techniques, he had made a discovery that had completely changed Margaret's understanding of what she was looking at. The empty chair was not actually empty at all. Digital analysis had revealed the faint outline of a figure sitting in the chair, so subtle that it was invisible to the naked eye, but detectable through computer enhancement. The figure appeared to be that of an elderly woman, dressed in the dark clothing typical of widows of the period, sitting upright in the chair with her hands folded in her lap. The image was extremely faint, almost ghost-like in its appearance, but the details were clear enough to suggest that someone had indeed been sitting in the chair when the photograph was taken, and that their image had subsequently been removed through careful photographic manipulation. Dr. Patterson's analysis had also revealed other anomalies in the photograph that suggested extensive post-processing had been done to alter the original image. There were subtle inconsistencies in the lighting and shadows around the chair, and microscopic examination had revealed evidence of chemical treatments that had been applied to specific areas of the photographic plate. The discovery that the photograph had been deliberately altered raised immediate questions about who had been sitting in the chair and why their image had been removed. Given the timing of the photograph and the family records that Margaret had uncovered, the most likely explanation was that the figure had been Eleanor Hartwell herself, and that the photograph had been taken before her death and then altered afterward to remove her image. But this explanation raised even more disturbing questions. Why would a family go to such elaborate lengths to remove a deceased family member from a photograph? And why would they preserve the altered image as if it were a genuine record of a family reunion that had taken place after Eleanor's death? Margaret and Dr. Patterson had decided to investigate further, beginning with a more detailed examination of the family records and correspondence that had been found in the Hartwell estate. What they had discovered was a family history that was far more complex and troubled than the cheerful reunion photograph had suggested. The Hartwell family had indeed been wealthy and prominent, but their prosperity had been built on a foundation that was less solid than it had appeared. Samuel Hartwell had made his fortune through a series of business ventures that had involved considerable risk and, in some cases, questionable ethical practices. By 1915, the family had been facing serious financial difficulties that threatened to destroy their social standing and economic security. Samuel had made a series of poor investments and had borrowed heavily against the family's assets, leaving them vulnerable to creditors and potential bankruptcy. The family's problems had been compounded by Eleanor's declining health. She had been suffering from a serious illness that had required expensive medical treatment, and her condition had been deteriorating rapidly in the months leading up to her death. Margaret had found evidence in the family correspondence that Eleanor had been deeply concerned about the family's financial situation and had been working on a plan to help secure their future. The plan had involved a complex arrangement with her own family's estate, which included substantial property holdings and investments that could potentially save the Hartwells from financial ruin. However, the arrangement had been contingent on Eleanor being alive to execute certain legal documents and to serve as a trustee for the family trust that was being established. Her death in March 1915 had threatened to derail the entire plan and leave the family in an even more precarious financial position. The correspondence had revealed that the family had been desperate to find a way to complete Eleanor's plan even after her death, and that they had been willing to go to extraordinary lengths to make it appear that she was still alive long enough to finalize the necessary arrangements. The 1915 reunion photograph appeared to have been part of this deception. The image had been intended to serve as evidence that Eleanor had been alive and well during the summer of 1915, when the final legal documents for the family trust had been signed and notarized. Margaret had found copies of these documents in the family papers, and they had indeed been dated several months after Eleanor's actual death. The documents had been witnessed and notarized by individuals who had sworn that Eleanor had been present and had signed them voluntarily. The photograph had apparently been taken before Eleanor's death, possibly during a genuine family gathering in late 1914 or early 1915. After her death, the family had hired a skilled photographer to carefully remove her image from the photograph, creating the appearance of an empty chair while preserving the rest of the family group. The altered photograph had then been used as supporting evidence for the claim that Eleanor had been alive during the summer of 1915. Anyone who questioned the timing of the legal documents could be shown the photograph as proof that Eleanor had been present at a family reunion that had supposedly taken place after the documents were signed. The deception had apparently been successful. The family trust had been established, the financial arrangements had been completed, and the Hartwells had avoided bankruptcy. Eleanor's estate had been transferred to the trust as planned, providing the family with the resources they needed to maintain their lifestyle and social position. However, the discovery of the altered photograph raised serious questions about the legality of the arrangements that had been made. If Eleanor had indeed died before the documents were signed, then the signatures on those documents were fraudulent, and the entire trust arrangement could be considered invalid. Margaret and Dr. Patterson had realized that they had uncovered evidence of what amounted to a sophisticated fraud that had been perpetrated nearly a century earlier. The family had not only forged legal documents, but had also created false photographic evidence to support their deception. The case had become even more complex when Margaret had discovered additional evidence that suggested the deception had involved more than just the immediate Hartwell family. The legal documents had been witnessed by several prominent members of Lancaster County society, including a judge, a banker, and a respected attorney. It seemed unlikely that all of these individuals had been unaware of Eleanor's death, given that it had been reported in the local newspapers and that she had been buried in the family plot at the local cemetery. This suggested that the deception had involved a broader conspiracy among the local elite to help the Hartwell family maintain their financial and social position. Margaret had found evidence in the family correspondence that the Hartwells had been major contributors to local charities and civic organizations, and that their financial collapse would have had significant implications for the broader community. Several of the witnesses to the fraudulent documents had been beneficiaries of Hartwell philanthropy, and they may have been motivated to participate in the deception to protect their own interests. The investigation had also revealed that the photographer who had altered the reunion photograph had been a well-known professional who had worked with many prominent families in the region. His name was Charles Morrison, and he had operated a successful studio in Lancaster from 1890 to 1925. Morrison had been known for his technical skill and his willingness to accommodate the special requests of his wealthy clients. Margaret had found evidence that he had created altered photographs for other families as well, though none as elaborate or consequential as the Hartwell reunion image. The discovery of Morrison's involvement had led Margaret to examine other photographs in his portfolio, and she had found several additional examples of images that appeared to have been manipulated to remove or add family members. In some cases, deceased relatives had been added to family portraits, while in others living family members had been removed for various reasons. Morrison's techniques had been remarkably sophisticated for the period. He had used a combination of chemical treatments and careful retouching to create alterations that were virtually undetectable without modern analytical equipment. His work had been so skillful that the altered photographs had been accepted as genuine by everyone who had seen them, including legal authorities and court officials. The investigation had also uncovered evidence that the Hartwell deception had been part of a broader pattern of financial manipulation that had been common among wealthy families of the period. The early 20th century had been a time of significant economic instability, and many prominent families had faced financial difficulties that had threatened their social position and lifestyle. Margaret had found evidence that several other families in the region had engaged in similar deceptions, using forged documents and false evidence to maintain access to family trusts and inheritances. The practice had apparently been so common that it had developed its own informal network of professionals who specialized in creating the necessary documentation and evidence. The network had included not only photographers like Morrison, but also attorneys, notaries, and even judges who had been willing to participate in the deceptions in exchange for financial compensation or other considerations. The system had been protected by the social connections and mutual dependencies that had existed among the local elite, making it extremely difficult for outsiders to detect or challenge the fraudulent activities. The Hartwell case had been particularly sophisticated because it had involved not only forged documents, but also the creation of false photographic evidence to support the deception. The reunion photograph had been a crucial element in the fraud, providing visual proof that Eleanor had been alive at the time the documents were supposedly signed. The photograph had been carefully planned and executed to maximize its credibility. The family had chosen a setting and occasion that would seem natural and believable, and they had included enough family members to make the gathering appear genuine and significant. The decision to leave Eleanor's chair empty, rather than simply removing her entirely from the photograph, had been a particularly clever touch. The empty chair had suggested that Eleanor had been expected to attend the reunion, but had been unable to do so for some innocent reason, such as illness or travel difficulties. This had been much less suspicious than completely erasing her presence from the family gathering. The altered photograph had been supported by other evidence that the family had created to maintain the deception. They had written letters and diary entries that referenced Eleanor's continued presence in the family, and they had arranged for witnesses who could testify to having seen her alive after her actual death. The deception had been so thorough and well coordinated that it had succeeded in fooling not only the legal authorities, but also many members of the extended family and social circle. Some family members may have been unaware that Eleanor had actually died, while others may have been complicit in the deception, but had maintained the secret for decades. Margaret had found evidence that the truth about Eleanor's death and the fraudulent documents had been known to at least some family members throughout the years, but that they had chosen to maintain the deception rather than risk the legal and financial consequences of revealing the fraud. The family had apparently developed an elaborate set of stories and explanations to account for Eleanor's absence from family gatherings and social events after 1915. They had claimed that she had become reclusive due to poor health, and that she preferred to avoid public appearances and social obligations. These explanations had been accepted by most people who knew the family, particularly since Eleanor had indeed been in poor health before her death and had begun to withdraw from social activities in her final months. The family's claims about her continued reclusiveness had seemed consistent with her previous behavior and had not aroused suspicion. The deception had been maintained for several years after 1915, with the family continuing to claim that Eleanor was alive but too ill to participate in public activities. They had eventually announced her death in 1919, claiming that she had passed away peacefully at home after a long illness. The 1919 death announcement had been accepted without question by the community, and Eleanor had been given a proper funeral and burial. The family had apparently used this second false death announcement to finally bring the deception to an end, while avoiding any investigation into the timing of her actual death. The success of the deception had allowed the Hartwell family to maintain their wealth and social position for several more decades. The family trust that had been established through the fraudulent documents had provided them with a steady income and had protected their assets from creditors and other financial difficulties. However, the investigation had also revealed that the deception had come at a significant personal cost to the family members who had been involved in it. Margaret had found evidence in family letters and diaries that many of them had struggled with guilt and anxiety about their participation in the fraud. The burden of maintaining the deception had been particularly difficult for Eleanor's children, who had been forced to lie about their mother's death and to participate in an elaborate charade that had lasted for years. Some of them had apparently suffered from what would now be recognized as symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, including anxiety, depression, and difficulty forming trusting relationships. The investigation had also revealed that the deception had had lasting effects on the family's relationships and dynamics. The secret had created divisions and tensions among family members, with some supporting the deception while others had opposed it or had been kept unaware of the truth. Margaret had found evidence that several family members had attempted to reveal the truth about Eleanor's death over the years, but that they had been pressured or threatened by other family members to maintain the secret. The fear of legal prosecution and financial ruin had been powerful motivators for keeping the deception alive. The discovery of the altered photograph and the evidence of the broader fraud had raised difficult questions about how to handle the information that Margaret and Dr. Patterson had uncovered. The crimes had been committed nearly a century earlier, and all of the direct participants were long dead. However, the fraudulent trust arrangement had continued to benefit the Hartwell family descendants for decades, and some of the assets involved were still part of family estates and charitable foundations. The revelation that the trust had been established through fraud could potentially affect the legal status of these assets and the organizations that had benefited from them. Margaret had consulted with legal experts and law enforcement officials about the implications of her discoveries. While the statute of limitations had long since expired for any criminal prosecution, there were still potential civil implications for the current holders of assets that had been obtained through fraud. The investigation had also raised broader questions about the prevalence of similar deceptions among wealthy families of the early 20th century. If the Hartwell case was representative of a broader pattern, it suggested that many family fortunes and social positions had been built on foundations that were far less legitimate than they had appeared. Margaret had begun to examine other family collections in the Historical Society's archives, looking for evidence of similar deceptions and fraudulent activities. She had found several cases that showed signs of document forgery and photographic manipulation, suggesting that the practices uncovered in the Hartwell case had indeed been more widespread than previously realized. The investigation had also led to the development of new techniques for analyzing historical photographs and documents for evidence of fraud and manipulation. The methods that Dr. Patterson had used to detect the alterations in the Hartwell reunion photograph could be applied to other historical materials, potentially revealing additional cases of deception and fraud. These techniques had applications beyond historical research. They could be used by law enforcement agencies to investigate contemporary cases of document fraud and identity theft, and by insurance companies to detect fraudulent claims that involved manipulated photographic evidence. The Hartwell case had also highlighted the importance of preserving and studying historical materials. Even when they appeared to be routine family documents and photographs, the reunion photograph had seemed unremarkable when Margaret had first examined it, but careful analysis had revealed evidence of one of the most sophisticated frauds in American family history. The case had demonstrated that historical materials could contain hidden stories and evidence that might not be apparent without modern analytical techniques. This had implications for historians, archivists, and researchers who worked with historical collections, suggesting that many materials might contain information that had not yet been discovered or understood. Margaret had worked with other historical societies and archives to develop guidelines for identifying and analyzing potentially fraudulent historical materials. These guidelines had helped other researchers to recognize signs of manipulation and deception in their own collections, leading to additional discoveries of historical fraud and deception. The investigation had also led to the creation of a database of known cases of historical document and photograph manipulation, which had become a valuable resource for researchers studying the social and economic history of the early 20th century. The database had revealed patterns in the types of deceptions that had been common during different historical periods, and had provided insights into the social and economic pressures that had motivated families to engage in fraudulent activities. The Hartwell case had become a landmark example of how modern technology could be used to uncover historical truths that had been hidden for decades. The story had attracted international attention from historians, legal experts, and forensic specialists who were interested in the techniques that had been used to detect and analyze the fraud. The case had also become a cautionary tale about the lengths to which people would go to maintain their social status and financial security. The Hartwell family's willingness to forge documents, manipulate photographs, and deceive their community for years had demonstrated the powerful influence of social and economic pressures on human behavior. Margaret's investigation had also revealed additional details about Eleanor Hartwell herself and the circumstances that had led to her family's desperate deception. Through careful examination of family letters and medical records, she had been able to piece together a more complete picture of Eleanor's final months and the impact her death had had on the family. Eleanor had been a remarkable woman who had played a crucial role in building the family's wealth and social position. She had been actively involved in managing the family's business interests and had been instrumental in developing the financial strategies that had made the Hartwells one of the most prominent families in Lancaster County. Her illness had been a devastating blow to the family, not only because of their emotional attachment to her, but also because of her central role in their financial affairs. Eleanor had been the primary architect of many of the family's most successful business ventures, and her death had left them without their most capable financial strategist at a time when they were facing serious economic challenges. The family's decision to conceal Eleanor's death had been motivated not only by financial necessity, but also by their desire to honor her memory and continue her work. They had believed that Eleanor would have wanted them to complete the financial arrangements she had been working on, even if it required bending or breaking the law to do so. Margaret had found evidence that Eleanor herself had been aware of the family's financial difficulties and had been working on contingency plans in case she died before the trust arrangements could be completed. While there was no evidence that she had explicitly approved of the deception that followed her death, her family had believed that they were carrying out her wishes by ensuring the success of her financial plans. The investigation had also revealed that the Hartwell family's deception had been part of a broader pattern of financial manipulation that had been common among wealthy families during the economic uncertainties of the early 20th century. The period had been marked by financial panics, market volatility, and changing legal regulations that had created both opportunities and challenges for established families. Many families had found themselves in situations similar to the Hartwells, where the death of a key family member had threatened to disrupt carefully planned financial arrangements. The legal and financial systems of the time had been less sophisticated than modern systems, creating opportunities for deception that would be much more difficult to execute today. The investigation had also uncovered evidence that the local legal and financial community had been aware of the prevalence of such deceptions and had developed informal practices for dealing with them. In many cases, officials had been willing to overlook obvious irregularities in exchange for financial considerations or to maintain the stability of the local economy. This had created a system where fraud and deception had become normalized among the wealthy elite, with participants viewing their actions as necessary business practices rather than criminal activities. The social and economic networks that connected wealthy families had provided protection from prosecution and had enabled deceptions to continue for years without detection. Margaret had found evidence that the Hartwell deception had been known to several other prominent families in the area, but that they had chosen to remain silent rather than risk exposing their own similar activities. This had created a web of mutual complicity that had protected all participants from legal consequences. The investigation had also revealed that Charles Morrison, the photographer who had created the altered reunion photograph, had been part of a network of professionals who had specialized in creating false evidence for wealthy clients. This network had included not only photographers but also artists, engravers, and document specialists who had been skilled in various forms of forgery and manipulation. Morrison's techniques had been remarkably advanced for the period. He had developed methods for chemically treating photographic plates to remove or alter specific elements while leaving the rest of the image intact. His work had been so sophisticated that it had fooled not only casual observers, but also legal experts and court officials who had examined the photographs as evidence. The investigation had uncovered examples of Morrison's work for other families, including cases where he had added deceased family members to photographs to support inheritance claims, and cases where he had removed living family members to conceal embarrassing family situations or scandals. Morrison had apparently maintained detailed records of his work, including notes about the specific techniques he had used for different types of alterations. These records had been discovered in the basement of his former studio building, which had been converted to apartments in the 1950s, but had retained some of the original darkroom equipment and files. The discovery of Morrison's records had provided valuable insights into the technical methods that had been used to create fraudulent photographic evidence during the early 20th century. The records had also revealed the extent of the network of professionals who had been involved in creating false documentation for wealthy clients. Margaret had worked with forensic experts to analyze Morrison's techniques and to develop methods for detecting similar alterations in other historical photographs. This work had led to the discovery of additional cases of photographic manipulation in archives and collections throughout the region. The investigation had also led to a broader examination of the social and economic factors that had motivated families like the Hartwells to engage in fraudulent activities. The early 20th century had been a period of significant social and economic change, with traditional sources of wealth and status being challenged by new technologies and changing social attitudes. Many established families had found themselves struggling to maintain their position in a rapidly changing world, and some had been willing to resort to illegal methods to preserve their wealth and status. The Hartwell case had been representative of a broader pattern of behavior among the American elite during this period. The investigation had also revealed the important role that women like Eleanor Hartwell had played in managing family finances and business affairs, despite the legal and social restrictions that had limited their official participation in economic activities. Eleanor's central role in the family's financial planning had been typical of many wealthy women of the period, who had often been the real power behind their family's business success. The deception that had followed Eleanor's death had been motivated in part by the family's recognition that they could not replace her expertise and leadership. The fraudulent trust arrangement had been an attempt to preserve the financial strategies that Eleanor had developed and to ensure that her work would continue even after her death. Margaret had found evidence that Eleanor had been aware of the legal and social limitations that her gender had imposed on her business activities, and that she had developed creative strategies for working within and around these constraints. The trust arrangement that had been the subject of the fraud had been one of her most sophisticated creations, designed to protect the family's assets while providing flexibility for future generations. The investigation had also revealed that the Hartwell family's deception had had lasting effects on the local community and economy. The fraudulent trust had provided funding for several local charities and civic organizations, and the revelation of its illegal origins had raised questions about the legitimacy of these institutions and their activities. Some of the organizations that had benefited from Hartwell funding had been forced to return donations or to restructure their operations to avoid legal complications. The scandal had also damaged the reputation of several prominent local families and institutions that had been associated with the Hartwells. However, the investigation had also revealed that many of the charitable and civic activities that had been funded by the fraudulent trust had provided genuine benefits to the community. The Hartwells had been major supporters of education, healthcare, and social services, and their contributions had helped to improve the lives of many people in Lancaster County. This had created a complex moral and legal situation where the revelation of fraud had threatened to harm innocent beneficiaries who had relied on Hartwell funding for important community services. Margaret and other investigators had worked with legal authorities to develop solutions that would address the fraud while minimizing harm to current beneficiaries. The case had also highlighted the importance of transparency and accountability in charitable and civic organizations. The Hartwell scandal had led to new requirements for disclosure of funding sources and had prompted many organizations to implement more rigorous oversight procedures. Margaret's investigation had also led to the discovery of additional family secrets that had been hidden for decades. The examination of family documents and correspondence had revealed evidence of other deceptions and cover-ups that had been unrelated to the financial fraud but had been equally damaging to family relationships. One particularly disturbing discovery had been evidence that the family had concealed the circumstances of a tragic accident that had killed one of Eleanor's grandchildren in 1913. The child had apparently died as a result of negligence by a family member, but the family had covered up the true cause of the accident to avoid scandal and legal liability. The cover-up had involved bribing witnesses, falsifying medical records, and creating false testimony to support a fabricated version of events. The deception had been successful in avoiding legal consequences, but it had created lasting trauma and guilt among family members who had been forced to participate in the cover-up. Margaret had found evidence that the stress and guilt associated with this earlier deception had contributed to Eleanor's declining health and may have been a factor in her death. The family's willingness to engage in the later financial fraud had been influenced by their previous experience with successful deception and cover-up. The investigation had also revealed that the Hartwell family had been involved in several other questionable business practices that had bordered on fraud or had involved exploitation of workers and business partners. The family's wealth had been built on a foundation that included several ethically dubious activities, even before the major fraud that had followed Eleanor's death. These discoveries had painted a picture of a family that had been willing to prioritize their own interests over legal and ethical considerations for many years. The financial fraud that had followed Eleanor's death had been the culmination of a long pattern of behavior, rather than an isolated incident driven by desperation. Margaret had also discovered evidence that the family's deceptive practices had been passed down through generations, with younger family members being taught to view fraud and manipulation as acceptable business practices. This had created a culture of dishonesty that had persisted long after the original financial crisis had been resolved. The investigation had revealed that some descendants of the Hartwell family had continued to engage in questionable business practices well into the 20th century, using techniques and strategies that had been developed by their ancestors. The family's legacy of deception had had lasting effects that had extended far beyond the original fraud. However, the investigation had also revealed that some family members had eventually rejected the culture of dishonesty and had worked to distance themselves from their family's fraudulent activities. Several descendants had become advocates for transparency and ethical business practices, apparently motivated by their knowledge of their family's history. Margaret had found evidence that some family members had attempted to make amends for their ancestors' actions by supporting charitable causes and by working to expose and prevent similar fraudulent activities. These efforts had been motivated by a desire to restore the family's reputation and to ensure that their ancestors' crimes would not be repeated. The investigation had also led to the discovery of other families in the region who had engaged in similar deceptions, suggesting that the Hartwell case had been part of a broader pattern of fraudulent activity among the wealthy elite of early 20th century America. Margaret had worked with other researchers to document these cases and to develop a comprehensive understanding of the scope and nature of financial fraud among wealthy families during this period. This work had revealed that such fraud had been much more common than previously realized and had involved sophisticated networks of professionals who had specialized in creating false documentation and evidence. The research had also revealed that many of the techniques and strategies that had been used by families like the Hartwells had evolved into more sophisticated forms of financial manipulation that continued to be used by wealthy individuals and families in the modern era. The investigation had thus provided not only historical insights, but also contemporary relevance for understanding how financial fraud and deception continued to be problems in modern society. The Hartwell case had become a valuable case study for law enforcement agencies, financial regulators, and academic researchers who were working to understand and prevent financial crimes. Margaret's work had also contributed to the development of new techniques for detecting and analyzing historical fraud, which had applications for both historical research and contemporary criminal investigation. The methods that had been used to uncover the Hartwell deception could be applied to other cases, where historical documents and photographs might contain evidence of criminal activity. The investigation had also highlighted the importance of preserving and studying historical materials, even when they appeared to be routine family documents. The Hartwell reunion photograph had seemed unremarkable when it was first discovered, but careful analysis had revealed evidence of one of the most sophisticated frauds in American family history. The case had demonstrated that historical archives and collections might contain evidence of crimes and deceptions that had never been detected or prosecuted. This had implications for historians, archivists, and researchers who worked with historical materials, suggesting that many collections might contain hidden stories that could only be uncovered through careful analysis and modern investigative techniques. Margaret had worked with other institutions to develop guidelines for identifying and analyzing potentially fraudulent historical materials. These guidelines had helped other researchers to recognize signs of manipulation and deception in their own collections, leading to additional discoveries of historical fraud and criminal activity. The Hartwell case had also become an important example of how modern technology could be used to solve historical mysteries and uncover hidden truths. The digital enhancement techniques that had been used to detect the alterations in the reunion photograph had applications for many other types of historical investigation. The case had attracted attention from researchers around the world who were interested in the intersection of technology, history, and criminal investigation. The techniques that had been developed for the Hartwell investigation had been adopted by other researchers and had led to discoveries of fraud and deception in historical collections throughout the United States and Europe. The investigation had also contributed to a broader understanding of the social and economic history of early 20th century America. The Hartwell case had provided insights into the pressures and challenges that had faced wealthy families during this period, and had revealed the extent to which some families had been willing to break the law to maintain their position and status. The case had also highlighted the role that gender had played in family financial management during this period, and had revealed the important contributions that women like Eleanor Hartwell had made to their family's business success despite legal and social restrictions on their participation in economic activities. Margaret's investigation had ultimately transformed what had appeared to be a simple family photograph into a window into one of the most complex and sophisticated frauds in American history. The empty chair in the 1915 reunion photograph had concealed a story of love, loss, desperation, and deception that had affected not only the Hartwell family, but also their entire community. The case had demonstrated the power of careful historical investigation and modern analytical techniques to uncover hidden truths and to provide justice for crimes that had been concealed for decades, while the original perpetrators of the fraud were long dead. The revelation of their crimes had provided important lessons about the dangers of unchecked power and the importance of transparency and accountability in both historical and contemporary contexts. The story of Eleanor Hartwell and her family's desperate deception had become more than just a historical curiosity. It had become a powerful reminder of the human capacity for both love and corruption, and of the complex ways in which family loyalty and financial pressure could drive people to make choices that would have lasting consequences for generations. The investigation had also revealed the sophisticated nature of the criminal network that had operated among the wealthy elite of early 20th century America. The Hartwell case had been just one example of a much larger pattern of fraud and deception that had involved dozens of families and hundreds of professionals throughout the region. Margaret had discovered evidence that this network had operated with remarkable efficiency and coordination, with different specialists handling different aspects of the fraudulent activities. Photographers like Morrison had been responsible for creating false visual evidence, while attorneys and notaries had handled the legal documentation, and judges and other officials had provided protection from prosecution. The network had been held together by a complex web of financial relationships, social connections, and mutual blackmail that had made it extremely difficult for any individual participant to withdraw or to expose the activities of others. The system had been designed to protect all participants while maximizing the benefits that each could derive from their participation. The investigation had also revealed that the network had been remarkably adaptable, evolving its techniques and strategies in response to changes in technology, law enforcement methods, and social attitudes. The professionals involved had been quick to adopt new technologies and to develop new methods for creating false evidence and avoiding detection. This adaptability had allowed the network to continue operating for several decades, even as individual cases were occasionally discovered and prosecuted. The system had been designed to contain and minimize the damage from such discoveries, ensuring that the exposure of one case would not lead to the unraveling of the entire network. Margaret had found evidence that the network had eventually been disrupted by a combination of factors, including changes in legal procedures, improvements in forensic techniques, and generational changes among the participating families. By the 1930s, most of the original participants had died or retired, and their successors had been less willing or able to maintain the complex relationships that had sustained the network. The investigation had also revealed that the Hartwell family's deception had been more elaborate and long-lasting than initially realized. Margaret had discovered evidence that the family had continued to maintain the fiction of Eleanor's survival for much longer than previously thought, and that they had created an entire alternate history to support their claims. The family had apparently developed detailed stories about Eleanor's activities and whereabouts during the years after her actual death, complete with fabricated correspondence and false witness testimony. They had claimed that she had been living in seclusion on a family property in a remote part of Pennsylvania, where she had been recovering from her illness and avoiding public contact. This alternate history had been supported by a network of family employees and associates who had been paid to maintain the deception and to provide false testimony when needed. The system had been so comprehensive that even some family members had apparently believed the false stories and had been unaware of Eleanor's actual death. The investigation had also uncovered evidence that the family had used Eleanor's supposed continued existence to justify a wide range of financial and legal maneuvers over the years. They had claimed that various business decisions and property transfers had been made on Eleanor's behalf or with her approval, even though she had been dead for years. This had allowed the family to maintain control over assets and investments that should have been distributed according to Eleanor's actual will and the laws governing inheritance. The deception had provided them with flexibility and control that would not have been possible if Eleanor's death had been acknowledged at the time it occurred. Margaret had found evidence that the family had eventually been forced to abandon the deception when changes in legal procedures had made it more difficult to maintain the fiction of Eleanor's survival. The development of more sophisticated record-keeping systems and the increased scrutiny of financial transactions had made it increasingly risky to continue claiming that Eleanor was alive. The family had apparently decided to announce Eleanor's death in 1919 as a way of bringing the deception to an end before it could be exposed by outside investigators. They had chosen a time when the attention of authorities and the public was focused on other matters, including the aftermath of World War I and the influenza pandemic. The 1919 death announcement had been carefully crafted to avoid raising questions about the timing of Eleanor's actual death. The family had claimed that she had died peacefully at home after a long illness, and they had provided medical documentation that supported this version of events. The false medical records had been created by a doctor who had been part of the criminal network and who had been willing to provide false documentation in exchange for financial compensation. The records had been sophisticated enough to fool casual examination, and they had provided the family with the evidence they needed to support their claims. The investigation had also revealed that the family had taken elaborate precautions to ensure that the truth about Eleanor's death would never be discovered. They had destroyed or hidden most of the evidence that could have revealed the timing of her actual death, and they had sworn all participants in the deception to secrecy. The family had also created false documentation to support their version of events, including fabricated diary entries, letters, and other personal documents that appeared to have been written by Eleanor during the years after her actual death. These documents had been created by skilled forgers who had been able to replicate Eleanor's handwriting and personal style. The investigation had uncovered some of these false documents in the family archives, and forensic analysis had revealed that they had been created using paper and ink that were consistent with the periods when they were supposedly written. The forgers had been remarkably skilled and had taken great care to ensure that their work would pass even careful examination. Margaret had also discovered evidence that the family had used their wealth and social connections to suppress any investigations or inquiries that might have revealed the truth about Eleanor's death. They had apparently paid bribes to officials and had used their influence to ensure that potentially damaging information was not pursued or publicized. The family had also worked to discredit anyone who had attempted to raise questions about Eleanor's death or the circumstances surrounding the establishment of the family trust. They had used their resources to spread false information about potential whistleblowers and had threatened legal action against anyone who had attempted to investigate their activities. This campaign of intimidation and suppression had been remarkably successful in preventing the truth from being discovered for nearly a century. The family had been able to maintain their deception long enough for all of the original participants to die, making it impossible for anyone to be held criminally responsible for their actions. The investigation had also revealed that the Hartwell case had been part of a broader pattern of criminal activity that had extended far beyond financial fraud. Margaret had found evidence that the criminal network had been involved in a wide range of illegal activities, including tax evasion, money laundering, and political corruption. The network had apparently used its resources and connections to influence political decisions and to obtain favorable treatment from government officials. They had made substantial contributions to political campaigns and had used their social connections to gain access to influential politicians and bureaucrats. This political influence had provided the network with protection from investigation and prosecution and had allowed them to continue their criminal activities for much longer than would otherwise have been possible. The system had been designed to ensure that any attempts to investigate or prosecute network members would be blocked or diverted by friendly officials. Margaret had found evidence that the network had been involved in several major political scandals of the early 20th century, though their participation had been carefully concealed and had never been publicly revealed. The network had apparently been skilled at operating behind the scenes and at avoiding direct involvement in activities that might attract public attention. The investigation had also revealed that the criminal network had had international connections and had been involved in activities that had extended beyond the United States. Margaret had found evidence of financial transactions and business relationships that had involved European banks and businesses, suggesting that the network had been part of a larger international system of financial crime. These international connections had provided the network with additional resources and opportunities, and had made it even more difficult for law enforcement agencies to investigate and prosecute their activities. The complexity of international financial transactions had provided numerous opportunities for concealment and deception. The investigation had also uncovered evidence that the network had been involved in activities related to World War I, including profiteering from military contracts and illegal trading with enemy nations. The war had provided numerous opportunities for criminal activity, and the network had apparently been quick to take advantage of these opportunities. Margaret had found evidence that some network members had used their political connections to obtain lucrative military contracts, and that they had then used fraudulent practices to maximize their profits from these contracts. They had apparently overcharged the government for goods and services, and had used substandard materials and practices to reduce their costs. The network had also apparently been involved in illegal trading activities that had violated wartime restrictions on commerce with enemy nations. They had used their international connections to facilitate these transactions, and had used sophisticated methods to conceal their involvement from government investigators. These wartime activities had provided the network with enormous profits that had been used to expand their operations and to increase their influence over political and legal institutions. The war had been a period of unprecedented opportunity for criminal activity, and the network had been remarkably successful in exploiting these opportunities. The investigation had also revealed that the network had continued to operate in various forms well into the 20th century, adapting its methods and strategies to changing circumstances and technologies. While the original network had been disrupted by the 1930s, some of its members and techniques had survived and had evolved into new forms of criminal activity. Margaret had found evidence that some of the techniques and strategies that had been developed by the network had been adopted by organized crime groups and had influenced the development of modern financial crimes. The sophisticated methods for document forgery, money laundering, and political corruption that had been pioneered by the network had become standard practices for criminal organizations. The investigation had thus provided insights not only into historical criminal activity, but also into the evolution of modern financial crime. The Hartwell case had become a valuable case study for understanding how criminal networks operated and how they adapted to changing circumstances over time. Margaret's work had also contributed to a broader understanding of the relationship between wealth, power, and criminal activity in American society. The Hartwell case had demonstrated how wealthy families and individuals had been able to use their resources and connections to engage in criminal activity with relative impunity. The case had also highlighted the importance of transparency and accountability in financial and legal institutions. The criminal network had been able to operate successfully because of the lack of oversight and regulation that had characterized the early 20th century financial system. The investigation had led to recommendations for improved oversight and regulation of financial institutions and had contributed to the development of new methods for detecting and preventing financial crimes. The lessons learned from the Hartwell case had been applied to contemporary efforts to combat money laundering, tax evasion, and other forms of financial crime. The empty chair in the 1915 reunion photograph would continue to serve as a symbol of the hidden stories that could be found in historical materials, and of the importance of looking beyond surface appearances to uncover the deeper truths that lay beneath. Eleanor Hartwell's ghost had finally been revealed, but her story would continue to provide valuable lessons about the intersection of family, money, and morality in American history. The investigation had also provided a form of justice for Eleanor herself, whose memory had been manipulated and exploited by her family's deception. The revelation of the truth about her death and the fraud that had followed had restored her dignity and had ensured that her real story would be told with the accuracy and respect that she deserved. The case had become a landmark example of how historical investigation could serve not only academic purposes, but also moral and ethical ones. By uncovering the truth about the Hartwell family's deception, Margaret and her colleagues had provided a form of historical justice that had been delayed for nearly a century, but had finally been achieved through careful research and modern technology. The empty chair in the 1915 reunion photograph had finally revealed its secret, but the story it told would continue to resonate with researchers, investigators, and anyone interested in the complex relationships between family, money, and morality that had shaped American history and continued to influence contemporary society.